Good morning to all who have gathered in Mount Vernon, Illinois, concerned about the future of rural and small libraries in the United States. And thank you, Carolyn Snyder, for that fine introduction. The Dean of Library Affairs at Southern Illinois University and I have worked together on several library projects, and we were happy to collaborate on this particular one. We had planned to make a joint presentation until circumstances forced me to call Darlene and ask if I could do a video presentation for my part with Carolyn to talk about the role Morris Library has in the dissemination of books to libraries in Southern Illinois. Darlene and I met in Istanbul a few years ago, attending an International Federation of Library Associations conference, where I was so impressed with her presentation to a group of women librarians from around the world. And I was especially happy that your meeting would be in Mount Vernon, so close to our home and to Southern Illinois University. Our home is in Makanda, population 400 in Jackson County, and incidentally has no library. And I hope there will be time for you to visit Mitchell Museum in Mount Vernon. You'll enjoy the beautiful setting and the galleries. Virginia Young and Lee Estabrook are old friends, while Jim Ubel, director of the Shawnee Library System, was very helpful as I began to probe more deeply into the various aspects of rural and small libraries. When Congress, in its great wisdom, enacted PL 91-345 in 1970, which created the U.S. National Commission on Libraries, it stated that the Commission would have primary responsibility for developing or recommending overall plans to ensure that library and information services adequate to meet the needs of the people of the United States, which are essential to achieve national goals. In carrying out this responsibility, the Commission shall, quote, conduct studies, surveys, and analyses of the library and informational needs of the nation, including the special library and informational needs of rural areas, end of quote. As the chairperson of NCLIS, I am painfully aware that we have not exerted ourselves to fulfill this part of the mission. Let me back up a few minutes to tell you how my interest in libraries and the federal role in libraries began. Growing up in the Chicago and suburbs of Wilmette and Winnetka, I was able to enjoy the best of libraries and even worked in the law library at Northwestern to help pay my tuition at the law school. Not until I moved to Southern Illinois in 1960 did I realize how lucky I was. The little town of Troy, population 1,200, across the river from St. Louis, was delightful in so many ways, but it had no library, and there appeared to be little incentive to organize one. With the help of the state representative from that area, Paul Simon, my husband, we managed to have a bookmobile stop at our public elementary schools once a month. The popularity of the bookmobile stirred up interest in the establishment of a public library in our little town. Soon we had donated space, which was a former funeral home. We built and painted shelves and collected books with the help of a good committee of women eager to see that their children had access to books apart from the schools. Of course, we had a very small budget, and then we made the next logical move to get a small tax base from the city fathers. Unwilling to put this tax burden on the citizens themselves, they set a date for a referendum, and we assumed that this would pass. Alas, it failed, and we realized that much more had to be done by way of information to the citizens to see what a library meant to a community, and not only for school children, but for older persons, farmers, businessmen and women, and entrepreneurs of all kinds. Well, it did take a little more time, but the referendum finally passed. Today, Troy has a fine new building with internet terminals, a dedicated librarian, an active library board, and a crowded reading room when I last visited. I know that a great many libraries, small towns, have started in the very same way. Later, I want to talk about a similar effort going on now in the town of Brookport, Illinois, with Leo Motley leading the charge. In 1975, I was invited by Speaker Carl Albert to be a member of the advisory committee to the first White House Conference on Libraries, which was held in 1979. This great experience of seeing on a national scale what libraries can do and how they have grown impressed me greatly. Whether it was hearing about the great New York, Boston, and Philadelphia libraries, or the very little libraries struggling for a foothold in the plains and mountain states and the Indian reservations, it was obvious that libraries are essential and important to our American life. The conference was organized by the National Commission on Libraries, and I decided that when I had an opportunity, I would ask to be on that commission, to do what little I could as a non-librarian but a passionate library lover to help libraries. Well, in 1993, I had that opportunity, and my appointment by President Clinton also named me the chairperson of this prestigious group. NCLIS is not a regulatory or an operating agency. It functions as an independent agency of the United States government under the executive branch. The 15-member commission, which meets quarterly, has a small staff headed by an executive director. We ascertain the nation's library and information resources by means of surveys, hearings, and studies. Policy advice to the President and members of Congress are developed from these activities. 5 members must be librarians or information specialists, while the remainder are persons who have a special knowledge of or competence in the needs of our society for library and information services. All members are appointed by the President with the advice and consent of the Senate. We all enjoyed a rigorous vetting by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, complete with fingerprints. Recent congressional legislation requires the Commission also to advise the Director of the Institute of Museum and Library Services on general policies with respect to the duties, power, and authority of the Institute, including financial assistance awards under the Library Services and Technology Act and projects known as the National Leadership Grants. Our website is www.nclis.gov for further information about our activities. We also publish an annual report. The report for last year is at the printers and should be ready soon. And I must add that we operate on a yearly budget of only $1 million as a micro-agency. Well, my initial review of the Commission in 1993 indicated that we had not been spending any time, money, or effort to develop and recommend policies for rural libraries. However, in the period from 1981 to 1986, our Commission promoted a rural information service program known as the National Rural Library and Information Services Development Program. Rural libraries were envisioned as future rural information centers. The program was different from other Commission programs, and it was planned to be more than a study, a survey, or an analysis of the library and informational needs of rural areas. Some work had already been done by the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Extension Service, the Cooperative Extension Service, and the National Agricultural Library to determine precisely what the informational needs of our rural areas were. Additional investigations and efforts had also been undertaken by land-grant colleges and some state librarians. Now, these were mostly separate efforts undertaken with no more than superficial cooperation among these established institutions. Also, the well-established and widely available Extension Service provided quick dissemination and diffusion of the results of research programs of the Agricultural Research Service. However, Extension was ill-prepared to satisfy the medical, legal, educational, and similar kinds of informational needs of rural citizens. Because of law and through experience, Extension has always concentrated its efforts on providing information about all of the various elements of agriculture, including cattle raising and aquaculture. Also, Extension Service was unique, at least then, in that it was proactive. It had a basic purpose: to diffuse and cause the use of the results of research among American farmers. Searching for, selecting, and providing information in response to questions about family, education, and community development was not the kinds of work that Extension agents were engaged in. Yet a growing requirement in rural communities was a need to acquire knowledge about health maintenance, continuing education, how to manage local governments, and how to access state, federal, and private funding resources. In summary, rural residents have a great many of the same personal and family concerns as well as societal problems as do urban residents. They just have them in a different kind of place. Answers to questions about these concerns were not the kind that the agents were prepared to obtain. On the other hand, these were the kinds of questions that were routine for librarians and information specialists. Thus, it made simple, good sense for the National Commission on Libraries and Information Science to start a National Rural Library and Information Services program in cooperation with the United States Department of Agriculture to give our rural citizens some of the kinds of access to useful information that persons in urban areas have. NCLIS and the National Agricultural Library in the Carter administration joined in a unique effort to provide rural communities with the same kinds of information services available in urban areas. The initiative urged that local libraries should become a one-stop shopping center for scientific and technical information in rural communities. Now, this had two objectives. Number one, to assure the accessibility and use of information by all constituencies of the United States Department of Agriculture, and two, the strengthening or revitalization of the community library or local library system as information centers. The joint effort of two agencies of government, the USDA, very large, and NCLIS, a very small one, had the potential to change the role of America's rural libraries from inadequately funded reading rooms into rural information centers. Unfortunately, this did not happen. The changes that would follow in the reorganization of the National Agricultural Library, Extension Service, and Cooperative Extension Service were regarded as a threat rather than a solution. There is today a rural information center in the United States Department of Agriculture, but it has no budget of its own, has a staff of 1.5 full-time employees. It does not back up rural libraries. Well, that story is history. What about today? 2 years ago, at the suggestion of commission members from the western part of the country, a hearing was held at Lake Tahoe, Nevada, to hear from librarians in mountain and plain states, Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, Nevada, North and South Dakota. The heartwarming stories of the valiant struggles to keep library service alive are most likely quite familiar to you. A few small libraries had no telephone. Many depended on the U.S. Post Office for book delivery, and the rates were going up for that service. Most depended on volunteers to keep them open, and all too few had an MLS librarian to help and guide the patrons. Surveys made by our commission reveal that connections to the internet were very poor in rural areas. And of course, without a telephone, it would be difficult to get connected to the internet. The rural challenge to bring schools, libraries, and communities together to make the most of their rural nature so that citizens of all ages can be involved is an enormous one. Rural library directors must build local alliances by becoming involved with the Chamber of Commerce, civic clubs, service organizations. Then the library becomes more visible in the community with a variety of citizens, and the library director is able to identify civic challenges or service needs not previously addressed or provided by the library. The people living in rural communities have the same, if not a greater need for online resources as their urban neighbors. And if demographic predictions can be believed, more and more families are opting for small-town life versus the fast-paced speed of the city. Fast and free access to the World Wide Web means more adequate funding must be acquired. No family should be isolated from information simply because they may be geographically isolated. State library agencies should continue to press the legislatures to make connecting rural libraries a priority. Guidelines for internet access should be made at the local level. Decisions about filtering software must be made by the boards of trustees, and they should review their written internet use policies on a regular basis. Well, it's easy to get sentimental about small-town libraries, but sentiment has to be joined with reality. Reader's Digest, in the April 1999 issue, has a story about a library in the small town of Lincoln, Vermont, which was ruined in a flood. The efforts of the townspeople to get it together again showed a community of spirit and a great will to have their old library back. It did reopen, and there will most likely be a drive for a new building. Let me quote from that story. "Libraries in small towns are like community centers, magnets for human contact. That's probably why they continue to matter in an era when so much information is on the internet and books can be found online. School and work, classes and clubs may separate us, segregating us by interest and age, but libraries remain one of the few places that still bring us together." End of that quote. And that brings me back to Brookport, Illinois. Leo Motley, with the help of some public-spirited citizens, has opened a library, stressing children's books and activities, but offering a wide variety of books for adults as well. Donated volumes are welcome, and of course so is funding. What the library needs most of all is the tax base to support its services. Jim Ubel, Executive Director of the Shawnee Library System, has given Mr. Motley all the help he can in this regard. Once that tax-supported public library is established, it will become a member of the Shawnee system and can benefit from all the system services. It will also be eligible to receive a wide variety of grants for building construction, purchase of computers, literacy programs, and cooperative activities with other libraries. I know that just as in my little town of Troy, that Brookport will get that tax support someday. It has to survive. To all the rural and small town librarians in the United States, where you work, I congratulate you. You don't have the architectural brilliance, the great reading rooms, the banks of terminals, a staff of librarians, but you have the spirit to make a difference in the lives of American citizens, and that is important. Thank you for listening to me. I hope you will give the Commission some feedback from this conference so we can work together more closely in the future. We don't need a White House conference on libraries to see what rural and small libraries are doing or hope to achieve. But I would like to schedule a hearing in Washington, D.C. on the needs of libraries and give them some national attention. The potential for involving the library in community economic development is great, and that's what Washington is interested in also. The quality of life is important in business locations decisions. I recall when the Wall Street Journal was looking for a publication place in the Midwest, and they decided on Highland, Illinois. Highland is not a great town, but it is a good community, and it has a great library. Well, there is so much that we can do together, and my very best wishes to you for a successful conference. Thank you again.